Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. Today, I am talking to Norah Lally. Norah is a New York-born, Los Angeles-based writer. She just published her debut novel, Back to Bainbridge, a coming-of-age story for young readers, which has been getting rave reviews and was selected as an editor's pick by Book Life at Publishers Weekly. Welcome, Norah.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
What I did not mention in your bio is that Norah is also, in addition to being a fabulous author, my BFF since we were 13 years old.
That's right. Yes.
We met in the 9th grade, Catholic school in New York, and we found each other. We were our own little island of misfit toys in 9th grade.
That's right. It's so true.
And I have talked about you a lot on the podcast, both
have
as
you?
My bestie. Yep. I mention you all the time.
I'm famous.
And you're famous. Your podcast famous on the What Fresh Hell podcast because you also had a baby when we were, 19 years old?
Yeah, just barely 19. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So your son was one of my first encounters, close-up encounters with parenting.
Mm-hmm.
So start your story wherever you'd like to start it, really. I know your whole story.
You do. You know all the ins and outs.
And also, I should say that we wrote together professionally for a decade in Los Angeles.
That's right. Yep.
And I believe, am I correct that behind you are the film art of our two amazing features that we wrote together?
That's
Bratz,
right.
Starring and styling.
Yeah.
It was an animated feature featuring the Bratz dolls coming to...
The first.
Correct.
The first Bratz movie. And then the second movie, which was Bratz Girls Really Rock.
Oh, originally titled,
right?
I believe, Bratz Camp Starshine.
Okay.
It was about... we blocked some of this out.
It says they really
Bratz
rock on the poster, so
okay.
I have no recollection.
I
blocked it all out.
Re-release. But
I'm only going by the poster.
Nora and I moved to Los Angeles together at the turn of the century. And we wrote together. We were
it was after
writers.
9/11, wasn't it? It was.
Yeah, it was right. It was early 2002, I guess.
That's right.
We moved.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And we wrote many things together, but probably, and I don't say this as a compliment to our writing career, most notably Bratz starring and
kind
styling.
of like, what we're known for.
Yeah.
And then I have our little documentary poster up there too, our Trolls documentary.
We also had a cable access channel for several years called Troll Concept, and eventually made a documentary film called Troll Tour, in which we drove around. I have talked quite a bit about driving around and living in a van, and you were my van partner.
That's right.
Yeah, we drove all around the country filming people for the Troll Tour documentary. Fans of the fans,
and that's too long a story to get into right now.
Oh no, that's a whole spin-off podcast. Podcast.
If people want to know more, I mean, if there's a demand, you could do a whole nother podcast on that.
There certainly will be a demand. How could there not be? So this book that you've written is a lot about motherhood. In terms of it's the story. Well, you tell us what the story's about.
Well, it's interesting because the story actually draws a lot from some of the themes that you just talked about, like about how we met and we're sort of like our little misfit gang all on our own, the two of us, and also the whole troll concept that our public access show was about, which was kind of more the same, right? It was about like finding your people when you don't feel like you fit in. And so that's sort of the main theme of the book. I call it an upper middle grade novel. My publisher says it's like every marketer's nightmare because it doesn't quite fit into middle grade and it doesn't quite fit into young adult. It's somehow straddling the two. But the protagonist is a 14-year-old girl and she's kind of struggling with a lot of those types of things, which a lot of 14-year-old girls do. And at the same time, she is really having a hard time with her relationship with her mom. and her mom is having a hard time with her relationship with her mom, who they have to move in with the grandmother. That's kind of like, that's the catalyzing event of the
Right. The
novel.
story opens with her moving to Bainbridge Avenue in the Bronx.
Right. Exactly.
And that's her grandmother's apartment. And her mom is a single mom and moving with 3 kids into this apartment with her grandmother.
Yes, that's right. And my grandmother lived on Bainbridge Avenue all throughout my childhood. So this is actually set on a real block, but all the characters are fictitious. And, this is not my mom or my grandmother or me, really. It's just some of the places and things and experiences are real, but it's total fiction.
Yeah. And when we met, you were 13, 14 years old, just about the same age that
as Vicky.
Yes. As Vicky, the lead character in the book.
Right.
Your parents had recently separated when we met. And this is a story about a girl. Again, you said it's not an autobiographical story, but finding yourself at 14 with this new family structure and starting to navigate that. And what brought you to this story and this kind of part of your life to draw inspiration from for the story?
I think that was just such a pivotal moment in my being me. Right. I think that a lot of everybody has their sort of like before and after moment in childhood. And for a lot of kids who grew up with divorced parents, that divorce is the thing, right? It's like before, at least if they can remember, before we were this kind of family, after we were this kind of family. Right. And so it's something that you learn how to cope with, but never really goes away. And so it was kind of a natural point for me to start at. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to write about, this story just kept bouncing around in my mind. And I really wanted to talk about the ways that sometimes mothers and daughters, especially when times are really hard, daughters will really vilify and blame mom for everything.
You don't
which is something I did.
Yes.
For sure. And it's often ironic because it's often the mom who's like sticking around and doing the day-to-day grunt work, and bearing the burden of a lot of it. And yet that's probably the reason why kids feel like they can take out their anger and frustration on their mother. Now, in my book, the mother is very flawed, as we all are, but, she has some, legitimate issues that are actually affecting the way the family functions. So, there's definitely reasons why Vicky wishes her mom was different than she was. But I think that it can be kind of applied to all different types of situations. It doesn't have to be her exact situation.
Yeah, I was reading the book and I've talked to so many people about it, and I have a almost teenage daughter. My daughter is 12, and so many of my friends and colleagues, because my kids are teenagers, especially my friends with teen daughters, it just resonates. I think the feeling that your relationship in those teen years is so fraught, and that a teenage daughter is so able to point out your flaws, like the joy and the terror of having a teenage daughter.
Yes.
Is like, they're like a joyful, often, but sometimes really harsh mirror that's kind of reflecting back to you things that you're doing wrong, and the tension of that as they sort of come into their own. And it's age appropriate, developmentally appropriate for them to be saying, like, actually everything you are and everything you stand for stinks. I remember doing it. You remember me doing it with my own mother.
Yes,
absolutely.
So what's funny is it's usually only your own mom, right? It's so personal, and that's what makes it so ouch, because your mom, I remember thinking, your mom is the best. Like, your mom was so glamorous. And your mom, it's interesting, I felt like your mom saw me in a way that my mom didn't see me. Like, because I was such a weirdo when we became friends, and I had like a weird haircut, and I was sort of androgynous, like not by choice. And like,
you didn't know, you weren't cool. No, androgynous.
I wasn't trying to be like stylish. No. And I was like, and your mom thought I was kind of cool. Like
Right.
I always felt very accepted by her.
Right.
And it was so weird because you had beef with your mom
Yeah.
because she didn't see you. And I
Mhm.
feel like that is such an interesting dynamic because there's that closeness between a mother and a daughter that makes it even more fraught than other
Yeah.
like mother and teenage girl relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting. And my mom, I was kind of the black sheep of my family, certainly as a 14-year-old. I had some very high achieving siblings.
Yeah.
And my mom had a sister who was very glamorous and theatrical and, wasn't obsessed with grades and doing well. And I just thought, like, that's where I belong. Like the ability to see yourself belonging in other places. And then it's hard to have that perspective as a 14-year-old that your mom has a different job than just to see you as a full human being and let you fly. In some ways, thank goodness, when I think about us as teenagers, that our parents were making some attempt to clip our wings at that time.
Yeah. We would have flown in a very zany
Yeah,
direction.
we were not flying straight. We were not flying right at the time.
That's exactly right. And I think that's what I really tried very hard to do in this book. And our screenwriting background really helped me in writing this book because I really did immerse myself and try to capture like the voice and thoughts of a girl who was in that situation. I wanted to sort of like show what was happening in this family through the eyes of a narrator who doesn't really understand what's happening and is, relating everything through this prism of how hurt she is and how she feels. And that's not necessarily what was actually happening, but that's the story that this person is telling because it's what they're experiencing.
Yeah. And the book really captures that journey so well that the 14-year-old is kind of on one side of the mirror and the mother is on the other side of the mirror. And neither one of them is right or wrong. Like neither one of our mothers was a saint or a evil villain. But at 14, all of the conversations that we had were about like those kind of archetypal roles for them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so it was kind of cathartic. I'm also writing this at a point where, my mom is in her late 70s now, right? Yep. 76. And she's,
she would
retired.
say that's her mid-70s.
That's her mid-70s. So sorry. Please. Yes, she's barely 70.
Barely.
She's retired now. My mom worked at the Bronx Criminal Court all throughout my teen years. My mom, it's interesting because my mom was a stay-at-home mom while my parents were married at first. But because of everything that happened, my mom sort of had to scramble after the divorce. And she worked at the Bronx Zoo. My mom was born and raised a Bronx girl. So her parents were immigrants from Ireland and she was raised in the South Bronx. And then when she was a kid, they moved up to Bainbridge Avenue. And my mom ended up working at the Bronx Zoo and then going to law school.
Yep.
And your dad actually helped her get some connections, which led to her long-term career, which was as a lawyer, court attorney at the Bronx Criminal Court, where she was for over 20 years.
And it's another thing as kids, you're like, yeah, my mom's going to law school, raising 3 kids. Like, what an idiot, And
exactly.
And as you look back, you're like,
exactly.
Your mom went to law school
with
while raising 3 kids.
I know.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
we should really be erecting a statue to her. Let's be fair.
That's one of the reasons why, as you know, this is such an interesting time for me to be writing this because she's now retired and it's kind of her time and mine to look back on all these years. And I'm thinking, wow, I just didn't see all these different parts of what was going on. I was so like hurt and traumatized and pissed off about all these different things, not wrongly, but it's just the way it was, that it's interesting. And I think part of that is why it makes it such an effective coming of age story, because there are those moments as you're growing up where you realize, it's really not that simple. It's not all about me. It's, my mom had a childhood. My mom was a little girl. My mom's mom made her feel some type of way one time. And now my mom is going through this. And even if it's just little glimpses of that, I think that we do that as we grow up, as we're teenagers. And then when we're grown-ups, hopefully we can actually see each other as full people. That's the goal. I still am working on it because
still
my mom,
a work in progress.
But yeah, my mom was just visiting a couple weeks ago, and
we're still working on it.
We're still working on it. But yeah, that's what I wanted to show with this story, because I have a 19-year-old daughter.
Yep.
So I'm on the mom side of that. And it's interesting because I kind of joked, kind of not joked to my husband, Jason, when Riona was about 3 or 4 and her attitude started coming out. I was like, this is really weird, but I feel like God sent me my mother as a daughter. Like, my daughter is a lot like my mother. And that's tricky.
Let's take a break. Me. I want to talk about your journey as a mom when we come back. I am talking to Norah Lally. Her new book is Back to Bainbridge, and we'll be right back. So we've talked about your perspective from the child's point of view. You're also a mom of 3. And so talk a little bit about your mothering journey, which I think I've spoken about on the podcast, because you had a child when we were 19 and then had a child. We have a child who's the same age. Your youngest and my oldest are the same age. Yeah. And we talked a lot about the differences between having a child at 19 and a child in your mid 30s and how different that is. So give a little background for those who have not grown up with you about your motherhood.
Yes. So when I was 18, I became pregnant, and I was madly in love with a punk rock guy named Eddie, and Meg knows him.
Very cool guy.
So it was like sort of a very, actually, when you think about it, sort of a stereotypical sort of like Catholic schoolgirl, busts out of her cage,
Catholic
and
schoolgirl
just
gone wild.
Picks the craziest mate possible.
Indeed. It was a surprising development.
Yeah. And this was a long time ago when like not everyone had tattoos. He was covered in tattoos. Yep. He was the bass player in a punk rock band.
People don't remember this. I remember when you first got a tattoo, my family was like, wow. Nora's on the road to damnation now. She's got a tattoo. Like try to meet someone without a tattoo now.
We got together. I got pregnant, and we decided to, go ahead and get married. So we had a shotgun wedding at City Hall when I was 18 years old. And then when I was 19, Harley came. Mm-hmm. Harley is my son, my pride and joy. He is now almost 34 years old.
He will be
34 on Friday.
He's 21.
He will be 34 on Friday.
No, I'm not ready.
And Harley just is the man. He kind of, this is really, you're supposed to really, this is the thing about supposed to in parenting. Like I did pretty much everything incorrectly with Harley. In that, the thing I didn't do incorrectly is I loved him. I kept him fed. I kept him housed. I loved the heck out of him, but I did sort of like, I was very young and I really relied on him a lot. Like he was my best friend.
Right.
He was my everything. You were my best friend, but he was also my ride or die little buddy.
Had to make room for Harley and the best friend trio.
So yeah, my relationship with Harley is extremely close to this day, but it was really a us growing up together situation.
Yeah.
His father also struggled with substance abuse throughout our relationship and throughout Harley's life. Unfortunately, he died of that disease in 2013. We were not together when he died. We had divorced, but We did have, Ed and I had a kind of off again, on again relationship for about 10 years, trying to make it work while Harley was growing up, which was very volatile for Harley. Harley saw a lot of things he should not have. So when I say I did everything wrong, I really did. I was really still, when you're 19, 20, early 20s, all through your 20s, really, you are really trying to find yourself still. And I was doing that while raising a child. So it was, I'm sure, quite chaotic for Harley if you were to interview him.
He'll be our next guest.
Yeah,
He'll be the subscriber bonus.
You know, he had a kind of unconventional childhood. He grew up in the East Village in New York City. For most of his childhood, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. I gave him the bedroom, you remember, and I slept in the living room.
Loft, yeah.
And he attended a public school, New York City public school. He walked everywhere. People used to call him the mayor of the East Village because he would walk around by himself at like 6, 7 years old. Everybody knew him. The corner store guys, the winos on the bench, like everybody knew Harley.
And to say the least, the cutest little boy.
So cute.
I had little boys, and he was the cutest.
He was so cute. And he's still very, very, very cute. Anyhow, Harley, being Harley's mom really shaped the course of my life. Being Harley's parent just made me realize all the things that being a parent make you realize, which is that, like, you know, life is so precious and it takes a lot of work, but it's worth it. And when you're responsible for another human being, obviously you have to kind of try your best to be a good person and keep your nose clean. I felt, you know, like I really needed to be responsible. So I think it really kept me safe in a lot of ways because I had a sort of reckless streak and I wasn't able to
confirm.
Yeah, I was not able to indulge that, or I didn't allow myself to indulge that because of Harley. So I think that the flip side of that is I probably just put too much on him in some ways, you know, made him sort of like responsible for me, like being a good person. And I think that, you know, I think as he grew up, he had to come to terms with that a little bit. And when he was about 10 years old, I met Jason, who's my husband now. And thank the Lord that happened because he desperately needed someone other than me and a like strong male role model in his life. And so Jason definitely provided that from the age of we got married when Harley was 12. And
I remember it well.
Yeah, you were there. And so it's been a bumpy ride in that way, but it's also been a beautiful journey.
And then it's 15 years later, you have your next child.
Right. Riona, my daughter. So I have 2 sons and a daughter, and Riona, my daughter, is in the middle. And she was born when Harley was, I think, just about to start high school.
Yeah.
And she's a cutie. She is a challenge. Daughters are hard.
Yes.
I was hard on my mom. She is, like I said, a lot like my mom. In that she's I'm sort of, I don't know. It's hard to describe yourself, but my mom's extremely high strung. And so is my daughter. They have the same energy.
Yeah.
And it's triggering for me.
It's so interesting how that happens. It's so interesting. You're like, here we are again. We're doing the same stuff. We're playing the hits.
Only with your mom, you can, like, you know, toss your hairbrush across the room and say, I hate you, and stomp out. No. You can't do that with your daughter, or it
Definitely
really isn't advised.
Really ill. We are a parenting advice podcast, and I'm going to take the stand, not advised to throw hairbrushes at them.
Don't do that.
Say, I hate you. That's off the list.
Thank you. So I had to learn some new tricks.
Yeah.
To deal with these triggers with my daughter. And
it's interesting.
They're kind of the same triggers.
We've talked about the fact that with Harley's childhood, there was the chaos of being, you know, in a relationship that was difficult and in a financial situation that was difficult, you know, not having really any money. And then when you had your daughter, you were much more stable, but then the challenges come anyway. Like, I think that it's interesting how sometimes we think that challenges are completely external. Like, well, if you have this, marriage and house and income, that then parenting kind of flows from there. And you've been in both parenting situations, and that's not so.
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, it's possible that I'm romanticizing because it's so far in the past. But if anything, I would say raising Harley was way easier, even though I did not have two dimes to rub together, as they say. And I did not have a stable partner. I had the blessing of ignorance.
Right.
And I was just doing the best I could, and it was good enough. I wasn't constantly judging
you weren't
myself.
Listening to parenting podcasts.
No.
You weren't reading parenting books and trying to do it right.
I didn't care what school he went. I didn't research what school he went to. There was a red brick building 2 blocks away, and I just sent him there.
Right.
Like,
dropped him off.
I was like, there's your school. Like, it was easy.
Yeah.
And everything turned out okay.
Yeah.
Everything turned out okay. He got educated there. He turned into a great person. With the more you have, the more you know, kind of like the more you agonize over everything. And so I think that did make it harder. The more money you spend, the more money you need. It's the same thing, right? It's like the more you earn, the more you spend, the more you need. So it never felt easier just because I had the things that you're supposed to have before you start a family. If anything, it just felt a little bit more complicated.
I think I really learned that watching you parent. That, I mean, you talk about the chaos and mistakes, and certainly I'm not saying that didn't exist, but what I remember is like the joyfulness and the happiness of that situation, and seeing you do it with zero resources, including a spouse. I feel like I took a lot of lessons from watching you parent Harley, that it doesn't have to be as complicated as people make it.
Yeah, but it's a really, really great lesson, because even if you do have a lot of things and a lot of resources, it's not necessary. A lot of parenting is just you, and like it comes from your gut, and it comes from what you have inside, and it doesn't really matter the rest of the stuff.
Yeah,
so I think that's good.
It actually works that way. And then you have a teenage son as well.
Yes. And then I have Ray. Ray is my youngest. He just turned 15 on Friday. No, I'm sorry. He just turned 16 on Friday. He's my baby and my prince. So a little bit of background about Jason, my husband, Jason, is that he grew up in foster care in the Bay Area. And one of the things that he and I talked about when we were first deciding to get married was kids. And by then, as you mentioned, Harley was already a teenager. He was like 14 years old. And so he had he had been raised as an only child. And I kind of felt like I might not want to have more kids because I had him so young. And I thought, wow, like in my 40s, I could do all the traveling and stuff that I wasn't really able to do in my 20s.
Right.
And Jason really wanted to have kids of his own, even though, he was by then a father to Harley. He also wanted to have kids. So this was something that we talked a lot about before we decided to get married. And so I agreed that I would have a couple more kids. I had Riona, and then after that, we wanted to have another child for Riona to grow up with, because, I had done this only child thing, and I thought it's nice to have a sibling to grow up with. But I did not feel like getting pregnant again. And adoption is something that Jason and I had talked about, particularly adoption through the foster system, since Jason had experience in foster care as a youth. So when Riona was about 2 years old, we signed up at the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services for their Foster Adopt program. And it's about a 1-year program, sometimes takes 1.5, depending. And it's a course that you take and lots of home inspections and background checks and all that kind of stuff. And essentially, you're committing to fostering, and if the child that you're fostering becomes available for adoption, adopting. So it's like a FOST to adopt program. And so Ray came to us through that program. Ray was 10 days old when we got the call. It was, I'll never forget it. And you won't either, because
forget it.
You had Mac, and you had, I mean, it was really fantastic because you had all this baby stuff.
I had a 3-month-old baby boy, and you found out with hours notice that you were going to be bringing a baby home. Yeah. And so I ran over with diapers and wipes and a crib and all the stuff, you know, the portable crib, because I had all this stuff because I had a 3-month-old.
Yeah, it was Barack Obama's inauguration day, and Jason and I had both called in, like, playing hooky from work so that we could watch the inauguration on TV. And we were sitting there on the couch watching the footage, live broadcast, and a phone call comes in, and they said they have an emergency placement of a 10-day-old boy, and could we come to the hospital immediately? And we were like, first of all, we weren't expecting a infant.
Right.
And we did have like a crib and stuff like that, because you have to have all of these things to get licensed, but we weren't really prepared for an infant. And so we were like, can we think about it? And the woman said, well, you have 10 minutes to think about it, and then I need to call somebody else. So we were like, okay. And so we got in our car, we drove to the hospital, and we picked up Ray, and thank God, because,
he's about to start driving you around.
He is. Yeah. And so, yes, then we adopted him at about 1 year old. Ray is a wonderful kid. He's a challenge too. I mean, he's got his own stuff. Every time when you think you're a parenting expert, when I say, hey, I've been doing this for 30 years and I've got it, like, no, because every kid is different, and they will test you and they will teach you new things every single time. So I
always say we have a parenting podcast where we talk about the challenges of parenting. When someone calls me a parenting expert, because I have to say, let me stop you there. Like, don't run into me at the grocery store if you think I'm a parenting expert.
Right? Yeah. There is no such thing. There is no such thing. And parenting an adopted child is very different. It has its own challenges.
All right, let's take a break. We've learned about you as a mom and as a daughter, and then we're going to come back and talk about how this all comes together in Back to Bainbridge. I'm talking to Norah Lally. We'll be right back. So the book is the story of Vicky, who's living with her mom, her 2 siblings, and her grandmother in this apartment in the Bronx. And there's a lot of aspects. It's kind of a simple story, but there's a lot of aspects woven into it, including Catholicism, multi-generational families, how they support each other and make each other's lives possible, and how they ruin each other's lives or make each other's lives much harder. Yeah. And so we both grew up in multi-generational families. You knew my grandma, our grandparents and aunts and uncles were a big part of our lives growing up. And so what did you want to say in the book about multi-generational families?
I think that, again, this is sort of like a perspective, a grown-up perspective, look back at what it meant to me, because at the time when I was in it, I didn't understand how important it was.
Right.
I always loved my grandmother. I loved my grandmother so much. And my mom and her mom had a fraught relationship.
Right.
And I loved that my grandmother loved me because I could throw it in my mom's face, like, because she got annoyed by her mom. So it was just fabulous. I think that when you're my age and you look back and you realize how lucky you were to be shaped by grandmothers and aunts and uncles and all of that big, messy jumble that makes a family, it's such an important realization, because when you're in it, it sometimes feels either whatever, or it even feels like, wow, these people are psycho, like, why do I have to be around these people all the time?
Right. Why was so you're looking for that birth certificate that says you're really a princess from like Moldova?
Yeah, and part of this story too is about Vicky fantasizing that she belongs someplace else,
Right.
which we all probably do.
Right.
That's another thing that adopted kids do a lot is they fantasize about what it would be like to live with their birth family, like
Right.
what if? And so a lot they'll fantasize about what their parent might be like. And
And
in
that
this
fantasy
book,
probably often involves them being a better parent than their actual parent.
of course,
Right.
with everything, yes. And so that's very much part of this story is that Vicky is very judgmental and harsh on her mother, who is the one who is attempting to raise her. And she is has a lot of fantasies about what it would be like to live with her father, who abandoned the family and who she doesn't know what he's like, but she imagines that his life is something that would be more suitable for her. And so that's something that I wanted to capture. I think that the other thing I really wanted to do in this story is just write a sort of love letter to my grandmothers. Both of my grandmothers were pretty remarkable women. My mom's mom, who I told you about, is the one who lived on Bainbridge Avenue. My father's mom, who I also had the privilege of knowing while I was growing up, was another remarkable woman. And she is someone who is also reflected in Vicky because she was abandoned by her father. Her father was a man from Ireland who married her mother, and they moved them to Phoenix. This, I don't even know when this was. It was like early in the 20th century. Moved them to Phoenix and for a job opportunity and then disappeared. And this was back when like that didn't happen unless like it was hugely scandalous for that to happen. And so my grandmother grew up, her mother ended up moving back to Chicago where her sister was a nun. And my grandmother basically grew up in a convent with nuns and her mother. And she was like a scandalous person.
Right. Right.
Because
through
they
no
weren't,
fault of her own, of course.
No.
Right.
Because they weren't a real family. Like this was just something that didn't happen to, good people back then. And so I knew my grandmother as this like extremely classy, generous, amazing woman. She had 7 children and scores of grandkids, and she loved to like host Christmases, and she was just so gentle and lovely. But as I got older and started learning more about her story, I realized that she was like holding on to this like intense pain, and she went to huge expense to try to locate her father all throughout her adult life and never found him. He literally disappeared into thin air. Nobody knows what happened to him. And she actually found relatives of his back in Ireland who she ended up connecting and visiting and becoming friends with, and they don't know what happened to him. So I really wanted this story to be an homage to the two of them. And also to bring to life my grandmother's neighborhood, which I loved growing up because
it was
so
evocative, the book about
really vibrant neighborhood.
The way you talk about Harley knocking around the East Village, it feels like the way that kids operate in a city is so unique and great. And it's captured so well in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I really wanted to do that.
And I think the lens, I mean, we talk about on the podcast, we've talked about it with developmental, we've talked about it with people who know about children's development, that like a child as an infant does not make a distinction between themselves and their mother. They view them as a single entity. And that there's this developmental process where you start seeing your mother, your grandmother. I remember so clearly, I was maybe 12 years old. I mean, old enough to maybe know better, but that my mom was talking about something and she said, yeah, I just blew that. I was so disappointed in myself. And I remember like this cold wash coming over me, the idea that my mother had experienced disappointment, that my mother, who for me was kind of this iconic person who never did anything wrong, and that was part of the conflict that we had, could have experienced a disappointment. It was like the scales falling from my eyes. This is a real person. And there's a lot of Vicky, the protagonist in this book, having that kind of realization about her own mom.
Definitely. Definitely. And that was, it's a bit aspirational because, as I said, I'm still working on it with my mom. My mom and I are in a great place right now. And partly I think that's because of my daughter and the challenges I've had to go through to learn how to cope with her personality.
Right.
And she mine.
Yes.
And then understanding that and sort of using what I've learned with my daughter, with my mother, has allowed me to be a lot more gentle with my mother. And she's getting older. And so I see that, my time with her isn't infinite.
Right.
And that too makes me a lot more gentle with her, and it makes me want to understand her a lot more. And I think that it was very important for me in this book to, even though it is, like you said, it's a small and sort of quiet story, I needed there to be the sort of lesson that Vicky was to learn in this it was a growing up moment for her, because it's one of those moments like the wash that you said you felt, where she is seeing her mom in a different way, in a new and different way for the first time. And not to say that they won't still go back to having their conflicts, but a door has been opened for her that allows her to understand, okay, like mom has these feelings that are completely separate from me, and these thoughts that are completely separate from me. And it's not an affront to me that mom does the things she does. Like, she's doing her own thing and she's my mom.
It just
and that realization's huge.
It just boggles my mind when we talk on the podcast how many years I spent. It didn't occur to me that any of the mothers in my life, grandmothers, were actual people. I have an aunt who all my life I heard, oh yeah, she had 6 children. Her husband died very young, at 50. And then she had these 6 kids to raise by herself. And I was like, yeah, can you pass the mac and cheese? And I remember having my second child and running into her somewhere. And I thought, why didn't we all stop what we were doing? And just, I wasn't alive at the time, but how did we tell that story as like a throwaway line? This woman survived raising 6 children by herself with no money. Like the inability that we have as children, and it is a biological imperative, and so it's not really our fault, but to say, oh yeah, no, my mom, raised me by herself on the Lower East Side and blah, 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 blah. Like, you did that thing. The fact that anyone is even alive in these situations, it's like you should build a statue to this woman.
It's true. And Vicky has that realization about her mom at the end of this book. And it's not all rainbows and unicorns, but they have a moment, a really, I think, touching moment together, where there's also, I think, the mom felt like she had to always kind of be so stoic and tough in front of her daughter. And so she lets her guard down a little bit too. So it's kind of both of them having a moment of change, because I think that part of the reason why we think that way about moms is because moms don't show that much vulnerability to people. And they say like, yeah, what? Like, so what? My husband died and I'm raising 6 kids. The show must go on, And so that too is like a thing where it's like, no, like, let's look at what's actually happening here. Like, I think that there's a way to express what people are going through that's more real and that people can relate to. And I think that Vicky is at the age where when she sees when her mom actually shows what she's been going through and says like, I've been struggling with this and I've been thinking about this. And Vicky's like, what, you think about things? Like, wow, like you've been worried about that? Like, it's like, that's where you can meet. There can be a moment of meeting and of understanding, which is something to build on.
Yeah, I
and
think
as
it's
the
a
relationship
story
grows.
for young women who are ready to start thinking about the inner life of their own mothers, but also as mothers, it's a good reminder that to just not always stay on the other side of the mirror. Like everything's perfect, you know. You don't
Right.
want to hand stuff to kids that's too heavy for them to
No.
carry. But I think us coming from that Irish Catholic background, I'm kind of relearning the lesson that it is okay to, in front of our children, say, you know, this is really hard. I'm frightened. I'm sad. Like that. I think that our mothers didn't feel allowed to do that as much,
Correct.
and that they felt so strongly that their job was to be a rock for us, which was
Correct.
noble. But I think there's a really beautiful lesson in this book about, and also the truth is going to come out in the end. Like someone is going to see the truth. And so
Mm-hmm.
putting so much effort into convincing our children that everything's great, nothing's ever all great. You know, you talk about these three really different experiences that your children had, all had good and bad in them, right? All of
That's
them
right.
had difficult aspects and joyful aspects and hard aspects and wonderful aspects. And you have, unique to almost anyone I know, three incredibly different stories about raising three kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that in the end, their story is all about like a mom trying her best, failing a couple times, succeeding a lot, and hopefully like coating the entire experience in this sort of feeling of joy.
Hopefully. Yes.
Hopefully. That's what I'm going to tell them.
That's
I'm
good.
going to
You
sit
tell them
all
that.
down
I'm
and
going to have them
wave
call you
fingers.
right
Yeah.
after this.
Give me their numbers. I got a thing or two to tell them.
Yeah, I love that you say that about the readers of this book, and I hope I hope that, you know, girls and even young women
Mm-hmm.
will read this and see that in it and kind of identify with that feeling, and have a little bit of grace for each other after reading it, because that is really what's needed. I think um, it's life is so hard, like it's
Mm-hmm.
so painful sometimes to go through, and when people feel wounded, it's just really hard to see other people's wounds. One of the themes in this story is about uncovering secrets and about
Mm-hmm.
the things that people try not to let out because
Mm-hmm.
they're not gonna, they're gonna be ugly or they're gonna be judged. And I just think there's a great lesson in the book, and hopefully I'm giving that lesson to my kids too, just in the way I parent them, which is like, even if like it's important to understand how you feel,
Mm-hmm.
and your feelings are valid. However, that doesn't mean that like it's all about you. Like you really, really have to try to understand how other people are feeling too. And just because you feel in pain about something, it doesn't mean that that person is necessarily doing something to you. Like
Mm.
everybody is operating in the best way that they know how to, for the most part. And so I think that kind of seeing other people and what they might be going through and where they might be coming from is, it just makes you pause a little bit before reacting. And I think that's a valuable thing to do.
Friends listening, if you have ever bought a book that we talked about on this podcast, or ever thought about buying a book that we talked about on this podcast, go buy Back to Bainbridge by Norah Lally. My BFF, best friend, and even if she wasn't, I would tell you, go get this book. I loved
you're
it
not just
so
you're not
much.
just saying
I'm
that
not
because
just
you
saying
have
that because
to.
we're besties.
Actually, you know what, Meg? It was the number one new best-selling new release on Amazon in the teen category.
So I'm not just saying it, people. Teens everywhere agree, and
People
moms
are
will
buying
love
it.
this book as well. Back to Bainbridge by Norah Lally. Tell us, Norah, where we can find the book and find more about you.
You can find the book anywhere where books are sold: Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Bookshop. If your local independent bookseller is not selling it, please ask them to order it, because that is the way small bookstores actually carry books. If a lot of people are asking them to order it, they will go ahead and order a bunch. So I highly recommend buying it at your local independent bookseller. Also, I just wanted to say that last month I did a school visit at PSMS 280 in the Bronx, in the neighborhood where this book is set. And it was one of the most enchanting, wonderful experiences because the kids were so excited about a book that was set right in their very own neighborhood. And the principal's ordering the book for the 6th and 7th grade classes to read. And so I'm also, really looking forward to connecting with young readers. And I have some like discussion and activities that I do with them. So it's something I'm looking forward to as I keep getting the book out.
We will link, of course, to our bookshop link where you can, should, and will purchase the book. Norah, thanks so much for talking to me today.
This is my first podcast. Thank you.
I was 13 years old, for talking to me all the time.
It was such a pleasure.
Love you, girl.
Thank you. Love you too.